Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into one of modern history's biggest paradoxes. We're talking about a story of good intentions, radical reforms, and, well, catastrophic consequences.
So this is the guy at the center of it all, Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, in the West, you probably know him as the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the man who ended the Cold War. But for so many of his own people, he's the man who wrecked a superpower. Think about that. He wanted to save the Soviet Union, but he ended up being its very last leader. So how in the world does that happen? How does the man who tried to save the Soviet Union end up being the one to destroy it? That's the big question, right? And figuring that out is the key to his whole incredibly complicated legacy. So let's dive in.
Okay, so to really get Gorbachev, you have to picture what he was walking into back in 1985. He wasn't taking the wheel of a finely tuned sports car. No way. He was being handed the keys to a giant, rusty, smoke-belching machine that was already breaking down. He inherited an empire in the middle of a massive crisis. The Soviet economy, well, it was sick. It was suffering from this deep, institutional disease that Gorbachev himself called the era of stagnation. I mean, for 20 years, the whole system was just grinding to a halt. It was being choked by this super rigid top-down structure where Moscow made every single decision. And what does that do? It absolutely kills any local creativity or initiative. And it meant the USSR was falling further and further behind the West.
And you can see it right here in the numbers. The lifeblood of the economy, the vitality, it was just draining away. And look, this was happening for decades before Gorbachev even showed up. Growth had slowed to a crawl. The system wasn't just stuck in neutral, it was basically in a nosedive.
On paper, this was the world's second biggest economy. But that's just on paper. In reality, it was like a giant that could barely stand up under its own weight. Think about this. The factories were pumping out tanks and tons of steel, but regular people, they couldn't find basic stuff like soap or toilet paper on the shelves. The whole thing was just rotting from the inside out. It didn't need a simple tune-up. It needed a complete teardown and rebuild.
So what do? Well, facing this disaster, Gorbachev prescribed two very famous, very radical medicines for his sick empire: Perestroika and Glasnost. The only problem? The cure was about to become the poison. First, you've got Perestroika. This literally means restructuring, and it was the economic medicine. The whole idea was to pump some life, some market-style energy into this stiff, centrally planned system to, just get the gears moving again.
But Gorbachev was smart enough to know that you can't just fix the economy in a vacuum. So he brought in Glasnost, which means openness. This was the political part of the cure. The thinking was, hey, let's give people the freedom to speak up, to criticize what's broken, and hopefully they'll get behind my reforms and help me fix it. And this is where you really see the central paradox. It's almost unbelievable. The difference between what he wanted to do and what actually happened is just staggering. Perestroika, his plan to fix the economy, instead created total economic chaos. And Glasnost, his plan to get people on his side, well, that just opened the floodgates for all these nationalist movements that would eventually rip the country to shreds. So what went wrong? The big problem is that Perestroika created this economic halfway house. Gorbachev basically smashed the old system of central control. He told factories, hey, you're on your own now. But he never actually built a functioning market system to take its place. So you're left with this giant vacuum, right? Where supply chains just fell apart and literally nothing worked. I mean, just think about it. The reforms took a wrecking ball to the main pillars of the old economy. You reduce the party's monopoly on power, you allow a little bit of private business, you tell the different ministries to figure it out for themselves. And the result isn't a new, better system. The result is you just paralyze the old one. And that led directly to that supply chain chaos and those massive shortages we were talking about.
All right, so that's the internal chaos. Now let's zoom out and look at the world stage, because this mess at home is about to trigger the empire's shockingly fast collapse.
This all comes down to Gorbachev's new foreign policy, which got a brilliant nickname, the Sinatra Doctrine. Why? Because it replaced the old Soviet threat of sending in the tanks with a new promise. He was telling the countries of Eastern Europe that they could now do it their way. It was a total game changer. He was basically saying, don't worry, the tanks aren't coming. And once that promise was made, you combine that newfound freedom with the chaos back in the USSR and boom, it sets off a chain reaction that moves at an incredible speed.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, that wasn't the end. That was the starting pistol. And just 2 years later, 2 years, the entire Soviet Empire, and then the Soviet Union itself, was just gone. And if there was a final nail in the coffin, it was the failed August Coup in '91. This was the point of no return. You had these old-school communist hardliners trying to rewind the clock and seize power. But they failed. And their failure proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the old totalitarian machine was completely broken. The central government was powerless.
So, where does that leave us? What's the final verdict on Gorbachev? Well, it's a tough one. He's a hero to some, a villain to others. And really, his legacy completely depends on your point of view. Look at this split. In the West, he's the celebrated statesman who ended the Cold War, a global nightmare, without a shot being fired. But for millions in Russia, he's the guy who oversaw a decade of economic misery and the humiliation of losing an empire. It's two completely different stories, and there's really no way to square them.
And maybe, in the end, that was his tragic flaw. He genuinely seemed to believe that this massive, rigid system could be reformed slowly, carefully, that he could somehow steer a controlled transition from that old totalitarianism to some better version of socialism, without the whole thing just crumbling to dust beneath his feet.
So in the end, Mikhail Gorbachev set out to be a reformer. He wanted to be the savior of the Soviet Union. But in his attempt to fix the system, he ended up accidentally unleashing the very forces that would tear it apart. He became the spark for a revolution he never wanted, and he presided over the end of an empire he never, ever intended to destroy. And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Was the Soviet Union's collapse always going to happen, or did one man's noble experiment accidentally push it over the edge?